Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and we might need a bigger boat because a new shark movie is swimming into theaters. Meg 2, The Trench. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So I'll admit, I am a shark movie guy. Shark movies are my jam. If there's been a shark movie made in like the last 30 years, chances are I've seen it probably more than once. I just enjoy that kind of movie for whatever sick reason. And in a lot of ways, sharks are kind of the most versatile of the monster, like the cinematic Hollywood kind of creature monster movies, ranging just a very wide spectrum of different tones and styles. You have like the kind of the peak of cinematic, blockbuster greatness with Jaws, and then kind of on the other hand, you have more the, the gutters of sort of comedy with like the Sharknado and the real silly like B or C kind of type monster movies, and really everything in between. And Meg 2, much like the first Meg movie, very much swims closer to the latter category. This is not a movie that has any aspirations of being a great movie, or I think the filmmakers are very self-aware that no audiences are going to this expecting to be wowed with like nuanced plot and deep themes and this sort of classic Hollywood filmmaking. People are going because they want to see Jason Statham punch a giant shark in the face and drop a one-liner. This very much a movie aimed to be sort of that silly, fun, kind of campy B-movie type thing. Unfortunately, even with sort of setting those expectations before going in, kind of down with those big sharks in the trenches, this movie is a giant dud. And for a movie with a lot of sharp teeth and big mouths, I think maybe the best way to describe this is by using a food metaphor. I think we all know something like chocolate cake is not good for us, it's not good for our bodies, it's not nutritional, but hey, we eat it anyways because it tastes fantastic on the tongue. And there's nothing worse than eating dessert, kind of consuming the obscene amount of calories for a dessert that doesn't taste good, that's not satisfying. And I think Meg 2 is very much like an overcooked, tasteless chocolate cake that just doesn't offer enough of the silly, fun, satisfying pleasure to compensate for the fact that really it doesn't have anything else of value to offer. I think part of the problem for this movie is that it just struggles to really commit to what kind of movie it wants to be. I think the kind of the climactic third act of this is probably the closest in line of what this movie, what the filmmakers probably wanted to make this movie, and what I think the movie probably should have been all along, which is a very kind of over-the-top, ridiculous sort of spoof comedy, just tons of crazy action. And I think it probably is no surprise that I think all the marketing for this movie has focused on scenes exclusively from about the last 30 minutes of this movie. It's sort of that fun, climactic, over-the-top tone, because really everything leading up to that last act is kind of a slog. This movie, it begins playing itself surprisingly, kind of unexpectedly just straight, kind of more trying to be a little bit more serious in tone, and sort of half-hearted attempts at horror that's never very scary and just very kind of dimly lit, and just a lot of kind of cringeworthy dialogue and just sort of heavy plot exposition dumps for sort of this very cliche type storytelling. And I think another issue with this is just the Megs themselves. I think because of what I think is unconvincing CGI, the sharks themselves never feel menacing, like even as menacing as like the practical, now dated shark from like a movie like Jaws. You never feel scared by these sharks. They do feel just sort of somewhat artificial. And even more problematic, I think, than that is that these sharks, before the third act, are just hardly in this movie. They're sort of left in a waiting pattern. I think almost for the first hour of this movie, you almost forget that you're watching a shark movie. They sort of make sporadic appearances now and then to sort of remind you that you're watching The Meg. But a lot of the action, a lot of the focus is on like humans versus human, almost like an uninspired action movie. And Jason Statham's like fighting, bad guy humans, without any shark or creature anywhere nearby. And even in the third act, when the sharks finally do kind of get their big moment, even then they're sort of forced to share the spotlight with this sort of other creatures. Like for some reason there's a giant squid also makes an appearance, and even a bunch of like lizard dinosaurs on the island, and they're fighting people, and the sharks just never really get a whole lot to do other than now and then sort of see their fin in the water. And it does become at least to me, quickly apparent that despite the novelty of the fact that these are giant, huge sharks, that the filmmakers never are able to come up with any kind of clever or inventive way to actually use them in the movie. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this thing, there's really not a whole lot. Language, there is sort of a handful of more minor profanities. I didn't hear an F-bomb. So if there was one, I missed it, but I don't think there was. So just sort of more mild language and a couple like crude words. Sexuality, nothing there either. The third act takes place like at an island resort, where men and women are wearing like typical like swimwear and stuff, but nothing gratuitous in that sense. And there is a kind of a pig-headed guy at the resort. There's a scene where he sort of gives unwanted, sort of aggressive sexual advances to another woman, vacationer, where he tells her that he'd like her to, why doesn't she come rub some sunscreen on his back? And he turns around and says, or my front, but they don't really pursue that in any kind of gratuitous way. And violence, obviously there's violence. People get, there's a lot of shark food in this movie, although maybe not as like horrific or like bloody as you might expect from the premise of the giant sharks eating a bunch of people. They kind of swallow people and people get chewed, but you don't see blood or gore. This isn't really one of those types of movies. It's more implied, the fact that a bunch of people are being eaten, but you don't see a lot of that on screen. Maybe the most kind of suggestive moment of violence, there's a scene where they're under the water in their scuba suits, and one of a lady's mask cracks, and kind of the pressure gets in, and ultimately it sort of implodes on her head, which is a very extremely graphic, violent implication, although you don't actually see the act or the aftermath in screen. The only other thing that comes to mind, there is a character that is sort of refers that that karma is going to come for one of these villain people that have betrayed them. So there is sort of some very loose religious, sort of maybe Eastern religious stuff that gets thrown in there. They talk later about like blessings and stuff, but that's just sort of that's never a central part in the movie. As far as things going on beneath the surface, themes and worldview, when it comes to Meg 2, The Trench, really the giant sharks are the only thing lurking beneath the surface. This is not a movie that is interested in exploring themes or raising interesting questions. This very much is just a base level kind of diverting entertainment. Maybe one kind of loose thematic thread that does occasionally kind of pop up in various scenes is just sort of this ideology or mindset of like finding your own way in the world. There is a scene where a character is talking to a younger, a teenager, and explaining kind of his history with his father. And although it was like a strained relationship, that ultimately his dad kind of pushed him to go spread his wings and sort of find his own way, make his own man out of himself. And kind of the younger character takes that to heart in the movie. She very much sort of disobeys her instructions from her like parental guardian figures and sort of makes rash decisions and tries to sort of find her own place in the world. And she is sort of at the end of the movie, in like one of the few sort of teaching moments that this film has, she's sort of commended, as though that's a big important life lesson that she's learned. Again, I think on the surface, that's a fine message to sort of find your own way, if a little bit sort of individualistic, although most of these actions that these characters take to find their own way, the paths they chart end up in just crazy disasters and loss of life. So it sort of undercuts the positive aspect of that message. And maybe just on like a more meta level, I think just the existence of Meg 2 itself might be noteworthy for Christians. I know just as a shark movie guy that some Christians have been uncomfortable with these types of movies, sort of monster movies, because they typically do feature a high death count and violence and people are being eaten. Although I think at their best, despite sort of the high volume of death, these sort of movies typically kind of emphasize and elevate life, sort of the courageous human survival against, the forces of nature. So I do think they can be taken in a more positive way, and some of that is reflected in Meg 2. But at least by the time like the third act of this movie arrives, kind of death has largely been reduced to just spectacle, and very much kind of death is used for like jokes and gags. And I don't think it's nowhere near like Cocaine Bear level of desensitization. Although I do think some Christians might want to just leave the theater just wondering sort of the value of entertainment that does treat kind of death and human life so flippantly. So in the end, I do think there are some sort of brief flashes of sort of the silly, over-the-top B movie that this thing could have been. Although I think Meg 2 kind of fails to ever capitalize on that or become anything more than just sort of mildly diverting entertainment. Hey, I think sharks are resilient. Even Sharknado spawned 5 sequels, but after sort of seeing Megs in the theater, giving them a second chance, I think maybe it is better if we just sort of, going forward, leave them back in those trenches. But hey, let me know what you guys think. If you guys enjoyed this, if you did enjoy sort of the, just the diverting, over-the-top, silly humor, if you got more enjoyment out of this than I did, or if you also found it just a little too dumb, a little too without any kind of nutritional value, would love to have a conversation with you about that. Encourage you guys, if you haven't done so, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. I got a lot of other movie reviews and live streams and just other things we're doing. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.